So you got a guy, typically it's a man, and he's married to several women at the same time. Or sometimes it's a woman married to several men, but typically it's a man married to several women. They hear about the gospel of Jesus Christ, and the family wants to give their lives to Jesus. They want to be saved. Now the church wrestles with the question, well, what do we do now? Here comes a man with all his, let's say, 7 wives. Does the church say, well, you want to get baptized, you want to be a member of the church, you're going to have to divorce at least 6 of your wives? Does the church tell a person to get divorced? Or does the church say, well, I guess we're okay, I guess you can be a part of your church, but we don't like it? It just puts, and theologians are trying to figure out, well, what do we do? What do we say to these families? There's children that are needing care, and each of these women have maybe children. Is the church really going to say, nope, you got to maybe pick one and keep that one, but the rest you're going to have to put out and break up families? Well, we know that it's not right to practice polygamy. That's pretty clear. It's wrong biblically. In the beginning, there was one man, one woman, and God said the 2 shall become one flesh. Not 2 become one flesh, and then you add a few more onto that. It happened in the Old Testament. People were polygamous in the Old Testament, but it was never sanctioned in the Bible. There's many things in the Bible that take place that God didn't tell people to do. And in fact, all of the relationships, the polygamous relationships in the Old Testament, typically there was some form of disaster, some form or another of disaster. King Solomon was known as the wisest person. He had over 300 wives. And he said, well, if that guy was wise, couldn't we have that many wives? Well, that's mind-boggling to me, that how that would even work. But it pretty much ended in disaster, and for that, in large part, because King Solomon was pulled in so many different directions. And in fact, even after King Solomon, the whole nation had a civil war because they were kind of sick of everything, and they split up into 2. Anyway, it didn't end very good. So it's clear that in the Bible that we're not supposed to do that. But what do we tell people? One of the biggest verses to me in the Bible why you just can't have a polygamous relationship is something Jesus said. He says, no man can serve 2 masters. Oh gosh, that was supposed to be a joke. Oh, that joke was a big dud. I don't know how you could serve more than one master, Jesus says. So what do we do? Why is this an issue? Well, it's an issue. I have to work on my timing and stuff. Why is it an issue? It's an issue because we're not living in the perfect world. This is a fallen world. We live in a fallen world. Sin has crept into all sorts of different places, and things are not ideal. And we would like to think, living here comfortably, that, well, if people would just act correctly, we wouldn't have to wrestle with these questions. If people would just do things right, then we wouldn't need to worry about what some polygamist does somewhere. And as long as people act right, then we would never have to wrestle with these issues. Well, maybe, but and sometimes we say that in our own lives. Things would be fine in my own life as long as everybody treated me right. As long as everything were perfectly fine in my life, then yeah, I'd be perfectly fine myself. Well, yeah, maybe, but we are not living in the perfect world. This is not heaven. We're living in the real world. We're living in the fallen world. We're living in a world where people hurt us, treat us poorly, cut us off on the expressway, and it's no good to say, well, yeah, maybe I acted out, but it's only because they did it to me, or it's only because this circumstance that I found myself in. I had a coworker that who had one of the worst attitudes that I've ever encountered, and just day after day would just have this terrible attitude, treat people poorly. And sometimes the other coworkers would call this person out and say, hey, what's the deal? Can you relax? And every day there was an excuse. Well, I'm sorry I acted that way, but so-and-so, did you hear what they said to me? Or, oh, yeah, I'm sorry I acted that way, but, I didn't get enough sleep last night. And, oh, I'm sorry I acted that way, but my kids, they're making me so mad. Oh, I'm sorry I acted this way, but, gosh, it's so cold in here. I'm just so angry that it's so darn cold in here. And it's like, I'm starting to think that maybe it doesn't have anything to do with your circumstances. Maybe your attitude is just really poor, and you're just using excuses for everything that's going on to say that, well, this is how I'm going to act. I'm beginning to think it's not the circumstances at all, though. I'm beginning to think it's something about your attitude, no matter what's going on in the real world. And so we're looking at the question of divorce today. We kind of polled and asked some, what are the big topics that you'd like to talk about? And divorce was number 3. And to me, it's a tough subject for me. It's tough to put this whole sermon together. It's tough to figure out what to say about this. I'd much rather be talking about angels and demons, honestly, like last week. Divorce is tough. Marriage is tough. And talk about where the real world, talk about where the rubber meets the road. It's this exact question. Jesus talks about this question. And he gives an answer. And it's a difficult answer because it's difficult. We have to wrestle with this because there's the ideal answer. There's the answer for the ideal world, and then there's the answer for the real world. And what's great about Jesus is Jesus doesn't ignore either. He knows perfectly well that people are living in the real world, but he also never, ever strays from the ideal, the real answer. So we're going to look and see what Jesus has to say about this. But before we do, a lot of us struggle with this idea. The ideal world in the real world. We have great ideals, don't we? We have great plans for our life. Maybe we want to lose some weight or something. We think, starting tomorrow, it's going to be great. Starting tomorrow, I'm going to eat right. I'm going to go out. I'm going to run. I'm going to go to the gym. It's going to be great. But then that's our ideal world. But then what happens when you wake up the next day? You find, I'm still living in the real world and I don't really feel like going out. And I still got some ice cream left and I better finish that up first. And I want to finish binge watching this episode. And then the real world hits. We have the ideal world and we have the real world. And it's tough for us to hold on to both. Typically, we will lean toward one or the other. There's people who lean more toward the real world type stuff. And these people will typically, when it comes to sin and ideal, the people that lean to the real world will say, nobody's perfect. Let's just forget it. These people will tend to ignore sin and say, it's nice to have those ideals, but not really. This is not practical. And we have to be realists about things. And I say, if you lean toward that area, there's a temptation to end up ignoring sin because you just think, well, that's just the way things are. And, if someone says, hey, you ought not to do that, you could say, well, listen, this is the real world. And in the real world, everybody does that and yada, yada, yada. There's some people who lean more toward the ideal world. And the temptation for the people who live in the ideal world is to end up being judgmental of others. These are the people that hold on to or tend to hold on to the ideal so much that if anybody falls short of it, you're cut off. And they have to make sure that everybody knows that you're not living up to the standard. And when it turns to Christians living in the ideal world, it ends up turning off a lot of people. It's the holier than thou attitude. Jesus is the amazing exception to this. Jesus has a way, unlike anybody else in history, this just amazes me. Jesus has this third way where he is able to hold on to the ideal world and in the real world both perfectly. And I don't know how he did it. Well, he's the Son of God. But he was able to do it in a way that nobody in history has ever been able to do before. He had a way of holding the highest possible ideals and standards. Any ideal the world could possibly think, Jesus' ideals and standards are way higher. His idea of holiness is way above everyone else. And yet, he had a way of living in the real world that was so compassionate and grace-filled that it blows my mind. He was able to do both of those things. Typically, it's the people that hold on to those ideals. Those people are the most annoying of all people. Everything's perfect in their life and everything's right, and they're kind of look down on everyone else. Jesus, who was far above that, the people that were living in the real world, maybe the people lost in sin, they saw Jesus and were attracted to Jesus. They weren't repulsed by him. They heard what he was saying, and they wanted more of it. And this tells me that somehow we need to follow this path where we hold on to the ideals, but we have love and compassion for the broken real world. We tend to think that, well, if we compromise on our beliefs, then or if we have compassion, then we're compromising on our beliefs. And so we don't want to compromise on anything, and then we end up not having compassion. But I want to tell you today, you can have compassion without compromise. Jesus did. Jesus had compassion without compromise. And I want to say to us today, those of us who would maybe tend to more live in the real world area, we don't need to compromise the message. Sometimes people think that, well, we need to compromise the gospel. We need to water down the message. We need to water down sin. We need to water down holiness so it'll make it easier for people to come. Jesus never did that. He never watered down anything. Jesus held the highest possible ideal, and the people over here said, wow, that's right. I need to follow that guy. Not making it easy, really, but holding up the ideal and showing compassion. And so Jesus, and here this is a perfect example of this, Jesus is asked about divorce. And this is from Matthew chapter 19, and there's a couple more verses that aren't in your insert that I'm going to read. But in Matthew chapter 19, some of the Pharisees come up to Jesus. These are the religious leaders of the day. And it says, some Pharisees came up to Jesus to test him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Now, I will stop there for just a second to help us get this context. So here's Jesus. He's debating these religious leaders of the day, and they're coming up to test him. Sometimes they would do this to Jesus. They didn't particularly care for Jesus, so they would try to throw Jesus some stumpers every once in a while. And the leaders of the day, this is not a new question. These theologians were wrestling with this idea, when is it okay to get divorced? In the Old Testament, it talks about how marriage is this sacred thing, but then it also gives provisions for divorce. A man can divorce his wife in these instances, or it doesn't say the instances, it just gives, it tells you that a man can divorce his wife. And so the theologians said, well, when can a person do this? Some of the rabbis at the time, one of the more famous rabbis at the time, a little bit before Jesus, he said, well, if your wife makes you angry, that's justification enough. You can divorce her. If she makes you angry, then you can go ahead and divorce her. One of the rabbis, Rabbi Hillel, his name was, I don't know if you've heard the name Hillel, but he was a famous rabbi a couple years before Jesus. He was famous for saying a few things, but he said, if your wife spoils your food or burns your food, that's enough justification, you can divorce her. I'm not making this up. You can look up Rabbi Hillel. He was very popular with some of the guys. Rabbi Akiva, another rabbi at the time of Jesus, Rabbi Akiva says, if you're married to a woman but you find a prettier woman out there, that's grounds you can divorce your wife for this. And so, and some people really liked what Rabbi Akiva said. So there's these wrestling. Okay, Moses said we could do it. When can we do it? And so they asked Jesus, we've been wrestling with this question. What do you think? Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? And here's Jesus' 2 cents on this. Haven't you read, Jesus replied, that at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female? He's going right back to the beginning. The Creator made them male and female, and he said, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Haven't you read that, he asks? So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, Jesus said, let no one separate. Now the Pharisees come back in. Well, why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? It's a weird way of saying that. Moses commanded that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away. And Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another woman, commits adultery. Ooh. So now here's Jesus holding up the highest possible ideal. He says, yes, I know this is what Moses said, but let's go back to the ideal. It was never supposed to be the case that divorce was even a thing. The divorce, he said, that's allowed because of sin, basically, because of the real world, because of the hardness of heart, Jesus said. That's why that's there. But if we, instead of arguing about exceptions and when can we do this and when can we do that, let's look at the ideal. What's the ideal standard here? And Jesus says, you can't just divorce just so you can marry someone else. I mean, like some of these rabbis are saying, that's adultery, Jesus says. I look and see someone else, oh, I like her better, I divorce her and go with her. Jesus said, well, that's adultery. Because marriage is supposed to be two people coming together and forming one flesh. And it's a much more serious business than just how we tend to feel at the time. Jesus here again is ratcheting everything up to the highest possible standard, which is what he always does, because that's what we need to hear. We need to know what's the ideal, what's the standard, what's the thing we need to strive for. When Jesus talks about lust and adultery, he says, anybody who looks at a woman with lust, or a man with lust in his eyes, has committed adultery. You think, whoa, that's a really high standard. Jesus says, if you harbor hatred for somebody, it's like you're guilty of murder in your heart. You think, whoa, Jesus, high standards here. Jesus doesn't stop. He just continues to say this stuff. If you call someone a fool and are guilty of shaming them in that way, you're in danger of the fires of hell, he says, in other areas. He says, if your hand is causing you to sin, you ought to chop off your hand. If your eye is causing you to sin, you ought to gouge out your eye. It's better to have one hand and one eye than to burn in hell. And people heard this and go, Jesus, your standards, oh my word, these ideals, they're who can hear this stuff? And yet, Jesus never shies away from it. He says, let's get back, like he says here, let's get back to the beginning. Let's get back to what we're supposed to be striving for. And he ratchets everything up, like I said. So there's the ideal about divorce. In the beginning, two people come together to become one. And there are provisions for divorce because, like Jesus said, because of sin, because of the hardness of people's hearts. He talks here about sexual immorality is one of these exceptions. In other places in the Bible, it talks about if you're abandoned, if your husband or wife leaves, you're not, and there's details about it, but you're not bound to them. And I just hear God saying, or Jesus saying, I know things aren't perfect. You're going to get hurt. So there's provisions for those things. But let's never forget the ideal. Let's never forget the standard. Let's never treat marriage like something that you can just drop at the drop of a hat. No, that was not the ideal. But we live in the real world. And even the holiest people in this real world can get hurt and have things and are treated poorly and are abandoned and are left or struggle with that. So what does God do when things go bad? What does God do when the real world comes in and ruins the ideal? Does he just ignore it and say, well, I guess just do whatever you want? No. He says he continues to hold up the ideal. Does he say when sin gets in and ruins things, does he say, you know what, I'm just going to wipe the slate clean, wipe the real world clean, and try to start again with a new ideal world? No. Time and time again, God comes in to our real world. He steps in and he takes our hand and he says, now let's move forward. Come on, let's move toward the ideal. And I don't think, as Jesus is so strong about divorce here, I don't think Jesus is strong about divorce because he is mad that people are breaking the law. I don't think he's mad about that. I think he's looking out for, well, first of all, women in the culture didn't have really a leg to stand on. If you were a woman in the culture, you really didn't have the ability to even divorce except for the most extraneous of circumstances. Typically, that was the man who would divorce the wife, and the wife in that culture, and this is a terrible thing, it's just how it was, but there was no way to make money or to sustain herself. So if a woman were to be divorced, she's basically left. It's basically you're leaving this person to live in poverty. And so Jesus says, no, I don't want you to, it's a more serious thing than that. We can't just do that. The two are becoming one. And again, I think he also knows that because the two become one in marriage, to separate that, and everybody who's experienced divorce knows this, to separate that it just feels like you're being torn apart. Because that's exactly what divorce is. It's a ripping apart of what has been brought together, and it hurts down right to your soul. Though there are people in here who know what that feels like. And I think this is why he's against it. Not because, like I said, it's against some kind of law, but he knows what's good for us. He knows what's healthy for us and what hurts for us. Remember, this is several years ago, but Amy Grant was going through a divorce, and it was kind of scandalous for some of the church because she was such a big name in Christianity, and she's going through this divorce, and she said something that I heard this, and I never forgot this, even when I was much younger when I heard it, but she said, "It feels like I've been ripped from stem to stern," she said. "It feels like I've just been torn right in half." And there were many Christians who abandoned her, said, we got to cut you off now. And she said, she was very hurt by that reaction too, but she said, if God's grace can't cover this, what hope do I have? And I was really even amazed by that when I was younger. Jesus states this ideal. No, it's not God's intention. God's intention that two people come together. That's the ideal. But the question is, how do we live in the real world? And we can look at Jesus. How does Jesus live in the real world? And Jesus always wants to bring the ideal world to the real world. So we can ask the question, well, okay, we know Jesus' thoughts on divorce. How does Jesus treat those who have suffered through divorce? We could ask that question. And the good news is we know how Jesus would treat people who have suffered through divorce because it happens on a number of occasions. Jesus runs into these. One of the most famous is what we call the woman at the well in John chapter 4. There's a woman who's trying to, I get a little emotional, but there's a woman who society has written off, and she has to come to the well to gather water by herself because nobody wants anything to do with her. And Jesus walks up to this woman, begins a conversation, which is scandalous on several different levels. And as he's talking to her, this woman is revealed has been married and divorced 5 times. And Jesus says, and the person you're living with, you're not even married to the person you're living with. So here's a woman. And remember, back in the day, women were not able to initiate divorce. Here's a woman that has been divorced 5 times, has been left with nothing 5 times, has been ripped apart 5 times, and is now doing whatever she can, and she's now living with a person who's not even her husband. And we think, oh my word, well, here's a person who's certainly not living up to the ideal. What did Jesus say to her? Jesus says to this woman, you're trying to draw water from this well. He said, but if you would ask me, I would give you living water. He offers salvation to her. He offers compassion to her. He talks about being the Messiah and coming to deliver his people and rescue his people. And this woman is so amazed by this man who holds the highest possible standard. She runs back to her town and she wants to tell everybody about this man, Jesus. She goes, I want to tell you about this guy who told me everything I ever did. And she's not ashamed of it. Because she knows also the compassion that Jesus has on her. There was a time when a woman was caught in the act of adultery itself. And she's thrown down before Jesus, and everybody's gathered around Jesus, and everybody, maybe they say to Jesus, Jesus, we've heard your highest possible standard that you give. We heard your thoughts on adultery. We know you don't like it. Here's a woman that is caught in the act of adultery. And if she's caught in the act of adultery, she can't, I don't know what she's wearing, but imagine how humiliating this would be. She's cast down. And they say, well, the law says we ought to stone her. And she didn't live up to the law. So what do you think we should do, Jesus? And he says, whichever one of you is without sin, you go ahead and be the first one to cast a stone at her. And it says everybody dropped their stones and they walked away. And he said to the woman, where is everybody? Is there anybody left to condemn you? And she said, no. And he says, I don't condemn you either. He says, now go and sin no more. He's holding up that highest possible ideal with the greatest possible compassion. Isn't he amazing? You may have been beat up by the real world. You may have even been guilty of hurting others in this real world. And I want to tell you, yes, Jesus holds up the highest possible ideal today, higher than anybody else. But the good news is, Jesus has more compassion and more forgiveness than anybody else. And he knows what it is to be hurt by the real world. Nobody was hurt more than Jesus by the real world, and yet he continues to show compassion to us. Some of us need to say today, Lord, forgive me. I sinned. I didn't do it right. Some of us here need to be just wrapped in Jesus' arms. They've been hurt by the world and need that comfort. Some of us may need to say, you know what, I need to remain celibate. Sometimes that's people's reaction to hearing it. But just because I feel in my heart I need to somehow live up to this highest possible ideal. But whatever it is God is calling you to, I want to tell you today, God's grace is sufficient for you. His grace covers over a multitude of sins. I was listening to a sermon by Matt Chandler, who I will sometimes listen to. I consider him to be a good preacher. And he talks about when he was a younger man, he was witnessing to this young woman, and this young woman had been in and out of relationships, had a couple of children outside of wedlock, and he was witnessing to her for several months, and would invite her to church. And finally, she said, "Okay, I'll come to church. If you'll come to church with me, we'll go. I'll go with your family." And so he comes to church with her, and he's been praying about this. And it just so happened that the preacher that Sunday decided to preach on adultery. And Matt Chandler is sitting here thinking, "Oh my word! Of all the things to talk about, here's this. What in the world is this woman thinking?" And he said the sermon that week was awful. He said it was terrible. He started the sermon by holding up a beautiful rose and showing everybody how beautiful the rose was. And then he said he handed the rose to someone in the congregation. He said, "Now pass it along. Let everybody get a chance to look at the rose and feel it and smell it and stuff." And he was talking about adultery. He says Matt Chandler says it was just all law, no grace. Adultery is bad. You're going to get disease. You're going to get hurt. You could get pregnant. All this stuff, on and on and on. And he said the whole time he's just cringing. He said he couldn't even look over at the woman that he invited to church. Was wondering what she was thinking. And then he says the preacher at the end of the sermon says, "Now where's my rose? Can I get the rose back?" And he says someone handed it to him, and the rose was all wilted and falling over. Petals were off, and it was disgusting. And Matt Chandler said the culmination of his sermon was, "Now who would want this? Who would want this rose?" And Matt Chandler said he was sitting in the sermon and he wanted to scream out, "Jesus wants that rose." Isn't that the whole point? That Jesus came for that rose? That Jesus loves that rose? Yes, we need to hold up the ideals. Yes, we do. But never forget, Jesus wants the rose. We need to have that compassion and grace that our Lord Jesus Christ had. I'm going to ask our ushers to get ready to go ahead and feel free to hand out communion as I close on the sermon today. When I saw, typically we'll do communion at the very first week of the month. That's just how we've done it. It's not a hard and fast rule, but just helps us to stay regular with it. And when I saw that divorce was such a highly asked question, I talked to Tyler and I said, "Tyler, can we move communion to the third week when I talk about divorce, because I really wanted us to take communion this week and go ahead and hand that out." God has such high standards for marriage, I think in part because marriage is the symbol of His love for us. It's one of the symbols that He gave to demonstrate just how much God loves each and every one of us. And so He says, "I want two people to come together and become one." He says, "I want the man to sacrifice himself just like Christ sacrificed himself for the church. Just like Christ gave everything for the church, that's how I want a man to love his wife. And I want a wife to love her husband with everything she has. Just the way Christ loves the church, that's how I want a woman to love a man. And this idea of marriage, it says throughout the Bible, is a symbol of God's love for us. And I've talked before about how in the culture at the time, when a man were to propose to a woman, a man were to propose to a fiancée, he would sit down with the girl's father, and they would come to an agreement about what the marriage would look like, and then they would share a glass of wine together. And the man would go to the woman after he had talked with the father, and he would hand the cup of wine to the woman and say, would you be willing to enter into this covenant with me? And if she accepted, she would take a drink from the glass, and then they would be engaged. Now Jesus comes to us, and at the Last Supper, Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper. And he did the same thing to his disciples. He said, this is the new covenant, the new agreement between God and his people. And if you would accept this offer that Jesus is making, then we're in a relationship with Jesus. The Bible talks about at the end of all things, what Jesus wants most of all is this. It talks about this great marriage at the end of things, at the end of the book of Revelation, where the church comes before Jesus like a bride coming before her groom. And the church, us, the church of Jesus Christ, is dressed all in white and is made pure because of the sacrifice of Jesus, what he's done for us. And Jesus wants to have us pure, wants to have us holy and blameless in his sight, not by us acting perfectly, but by his sacrifice. Why? Because he wants a relationship with us, and he wants to have us pure and holy and blameless. And if we would accept his offer, then he says, I will make you holy. I will make you pure.